have been thinking about what you said about justice being secured by various other means, and that it does not have to come with hatred, and I mean, not in the spirit of vengeance, right?
Right.
So it got me thinking about how the state can practice karuna and maitri in the case of death penalty, especially in the case of sexual harassment. And does then, when we talk about justice being secured by various other means, are we trying to rethink an idea of restorative justice? Because I'm primarily interested around this idea, and if an idea such as restorative justice can even be present in a state like India. So that would be one of the questions. And the second question is that, since you are also interested in education and in school education, I I have been a sexuality educator, and I wanted to ask if, again, justice being served through other means, can education be therefore a torchbearer of distributing the idea of justice, the idea of Maitri, since you spoke about Maitri being a social fellowship? So can then pedagogical measures like comprehensive sexuality be a part of it?
Thanks, Ananya. The question of justice in the state is, of course, very, very complex, and Ambedkar's views, as expounded in the Buddha and his Dhamma and elsewhere, are very suggestive. But also, we have his own practice. He was, after all, part of the state for a considerable part of his life. And as a labor minister, as the law minister, I think he tried to keep in focus what he often called a very delicate balance between supporting the claims of liberty, inequality, and instituting strong state action against inequality and injustice. So I think that was a balance that had to be reworked in every instance. There is no one golden rule as to how this could be done. So I think for him, the delicacy of this whole thing, and it's interesting he uses the word delicate. Delicate is not a word he used with respect to the state ever. But I think Ambedkar also understood that the processes which would bring about such a justice, which is both attentive to debate, openness, liberty, but which will also legislate against inequality and injustice. How do you strike that balance? You would strike it only through the setting up of complicated legal protocols, or does the state have to be charged with a certain kind of ethical discretion, which means that those who are the state have to have that ethical sensibility? So I think for Ambedkar, all these would devolve onto the question of the kind of civil society we are and the society that we wish to become and the pressure we put on the state. So that is a dialectical relationship between society and the state. And therefore, your question about restorative justice becomes important, because restorative justice, which of course we see a bit in evidence, but not always a gloriously successful evidence, in the kind of truth and reconciliation commissions that have emerged from South Africa to Indonesia to Cambodia, to different parts of the world. But I think crucially in these processes, what comes to the fore, whether justice is served in a material sense, and this is important. I mean, as Ambedkar often reminds us, the ideal must be practicable at some level. Restorative justice might help heal certain wounds, perhaps, if you come out in public and you say, I did wrong, but whether it will restore whatever an individual has lost by way of a loved one, by way of economic or social resources. So restorative justice accompanied by practicable state action in a material sense would be an ideal situation. But restorative justice, which does not have that punitive component, whether by way of compensation, whether by way of something that makes the one that has indulged in acts of violence return something to society, return something to the victim, that may not be entirely a fair thing. And I think, therefore, Ambedkar's whole notion of delicacy becomes a very important thing to keep in mind when it comes to justice. And pedagogy certainly has a role to play, and sexuality education being a very crucial aspect of it. If you think especially of Ambedkar's concern with the world of reproduction, that it is so vitiated by enclosures and fortifications of different kinds, and how do we work against that? And he himself, of course, set great store by education. He wanted to start a school for democracy towards the end of his life, and he followed experiments with political education across the world with great interest, including Howard Selsam's school for the social sciences. Selsom was a member of the American Communist Party So he was familiar with all with these experiments, and he would have been very interested in that sort of public pedagogy.
Thanks, ma'am. Thanks for your time. And also, I thank AKSC for this wonderful opportunity. It was a really good during quarantine time, and thanks everyone. Ma'am, I have a couple of questions. One related to today's topic. The other one is something to you. The first one is why Ambedkar proposed Buddhism instead of atheism. That is one. The other one is so everyone will have a friend circle, and many will be kind of sangis, right? So how you handle those kind of friends, and have you ever converted a sangi to Ambedkarite or Periyarite?
Let me take the second question first, Madhi, because it's an interesting question. I don't know if I have any friends who are Sanghis. There are people who hold opinions that are very different from mine, and over a period of time, one has tried to be in dialogue with people like that. And let me tell you, dissensions with friends can be very fierce, even if they are not Sanghis. And especially when it has come to Dr. Ambedkar's writings. I mean, Devati and I have been doing these classes for the last 5 years or 6 years. And we've had a lot of extremely hostile reactions to Ambedkar's thought world from progressive circles. So it's not as if only Sanghis are the ones you have to deal with sometimes. I do think that it is really practice and biting your teeth and going on and trying to be polite and trying to be rational. But also, let's not forget that conversion is not simply at the level of personal argument and personal conviction and so on. It's also about creating social resources which will challenge some of these very vile and horrible things that people are saying. So for every Sanghi who's an acquaintance in our circle or even a friend who's saying these things, there are people out there who are creating hateful systems of thought. So I think one has to work not simply at the level of addressing an individual. There is so much you can do with an individual. My personal thing is to non-cooperate with people who will not be part of any democratic argument, and try to work at creating broader systems of systematic thought, which then become strong enough to sort of challenge these things that are said in public, because every Sanghi is also picking on something that's a body of thought that's come to her or him, no? So I think the struggle is not simply at the level of the individual, though at the level of the individual it's important. How do you do this without hating the Sanghi is a very good question. Without getting angry with the Sanghi is a very good question. Not easy, not at all easy, but I think what Ambedkar would want us to do if we were to read the Buddha and his Dhamma is that you constantly realize that what is coming at you is not simply an individual aberration, but it's an individual aberration that's been systematically cultivated for centuries. And therefore, one has to have that kind of forbearance and patience to deal with it while challenging it with angrily and bitterly. And Ambedkar also says that hatred can be a creative force sometimes. Not hatred which is personally directed, but hatred at a political philosophy that denies humanity. So we may have to think along those lines. As to why he didn't choose atheism, you see, like one of the things that I've been trying to sort of suggest through my lectures is that for Ambedkar, an ethical order was very, very important. And we did not see atheism as sort of coming to you with an inbuilt constitutive ethical order. There may be atheists who are ethical, but a practice of ethics is not central to atheism. You can be an atheist and you can also be a completely unmindful person. So I think what will anchor ethics is an entire philosophy of life itself, which usually religion has supplied. And Ambedkar is, of course, not interested in religions which come with that sort of a thing about human beings believing in certain, having certain beliefs or believing in God, but he chooses a civilizational tradition which has no room for God or the soul, but which is equally committed to understanding the nature of suffering, understanding the nature of unhappiness, and which wants to emancipate us from all of that.
Thanks, ma'am.
Hello, ma'am. This is Anushka from Mumbai. Thank you very much for your generosity and also to AKSC. My question is regarding this particular part called Vinaya in Buddha and his Dhamma. And one really stumbles upon Vinaya for girls, that particular part in it. So I'm trying to understand how to read it. I'm guessing it cannot be read only in a moralistic sense, or also why Ambedkar would include it in the book.
That's a good question, Anushka, because it's also a part where I stumble upon when I read Buddha and his Dhamma. It's more or less straightly taken from the canon, and he hasn't annotated it or framed it, which is of course surprising because we know that he held views which were not at all similar to what is expounded in the Vinaya for girls, Vinaya for married women, and so on. Perhaps what we might have to do, therefore, is something that I suggested in my talk, that you always read things together. So you go back and read something like Rise and Fall of Hindu Women, or you read Against the Madness of Manu, or you read Caste in India, to remind yourself that Ambedkar's position has been consistent, and here he is just taken from the canon and left it uncommented on, though he does bring something back from the canon in his own words, in his descriptions of Vishaka and Ambapali and so on. But as I said, this is a text that Ambedkar did not feel was complete, so he might have come back to it. It's hard for us to say, but it is a difficult part of the text. And I must say that there's also a similar issue with Pandit Ayodhidas's magnificent rewriting of the Buddha's life, Adi Vedam in Tamil, where he also has extremely Catholic expansive views. And even on the women's question, he was not sort of given to expounding retrogressive views, but he retains this part of the Vinaya himself. So it's an interesting question to keep in mind. And I don't think I have any particular sort of insight beyond what I've told you.
Hello, ma'am.
Right.
Hi, ma'am. Ma'am, thank you for your lecture series. First of all, I want to clarify one thing from COVID-19. That COVID-19, I have read one article about in Poovalagi Nanbargal magazine. That article make a shocking statement that out of 33 virus, 5 virus has been coming to the spread into the world. That's why we have to, this COVID-19 has taught us to think about the climate changes. And the next question is about Ambedkar. Ambedkar, when Ambedkar converted, removed from Hinduism to Buddhism, he asked a suggestion to Periyar which religion can be I can embrace. Periyar, some of them will say that Periyar said that yeah, you can embrace Islam, but why did Ambedkar did not accept it, and why embraced Buddhism instead of Islam about the suggestion of Periyar?
Yeah. I don't know if you were present in my last lecture, Abdul, but I did address this question at length in my last lecture. I don't think it was a simple question of Ambedkar asking Periyar for advice. This is a kind of folklore we have about the relationship between great personalities, which is, of course, the way we receive history itself. I'm not going to sort of comment on that, but basically, Ambedkar's interest in Buddhism was lifelong. He was following writings on Buddhism for a very long time. He was not attracted to any of the other religions for various reasons. For one, he did not want a religion which postulated the importance of an all-pervasive, all-omniscient God. He was not interested in questions of belief that you need to have towards God to say anything else about human society. So many religions were therefore not interesting enough for him for precisely that reason. And secondly, I think Periyar did not counsel Islam as an option to Ambedkar. Periyar counseled Islam as an option to anybody who wished to renounce caste and get out of it, particularly in the context of Tamil Nadu, where for a very long time Tamil Muslims were very supportive of the fight against caste and had shown themselves to be extremely sort of invested in addressing the issue of untouchability. And in that context, Ambedkar also felt, Periyar also felt that Islam had all these important social principles, the principle of brotherhood and so on, which will counter the caste order. But I don't think he, as such, counseled Ambedkar to settle for Islam rather than any other religion. And I think Ambedkar had a very complicated relationship with the Muslim League and with the various other Muslim groups that were active in India at that time. And I've also spoken about this. But I think apart from all of that, his interest was in a religion in his own understanding, which talked about the relationships between human beings rather than between human beings and God. Ambedkar was disinterested in God.
Thank you for the lecture series. It's been very informative. My question has to do with what was the Indian state at the time's reaction to Ambedkar calling for mass conversion, calling for an
Conversion.
oppressed group, yeah, calling for an oppressed group to essentially just break away from their shackles. You know,
Yeah, that's actually a weighty question because the answer is not weighty. I think the Indian state and the Indian civil order more or less refused to see the conversion as having anything to do with themselves. They felt that it had to do with the Dalits that they were converting, but they really didn't see it as this monumental event that it was, this great historical moment that it was, which was serving notice on them basically, right? It was saying that as a society, you are not able to attend to social suffering. You are not able to attend to issues of inequality and hurt. You have failed those that are invested in justice and humanity. I mean, it was basically that. But I think there was a profound and founded indifference to this whole event. There may have been immediate newspaper stories, opinions traded back and forth, but I don't think there has been a sort of strong critical engagement with the fact of conversion itself, either from the civil order or from the state. And this, I think, is cause for great anguish and concern because think about it, more than 4 million people say that we are leaving behind a historical civilization and we are entering into something else. This ought to have sort of garnered widespread angst or anxiety or happiness or anger or something. But this is what Ambedkar often argued, that one way in which caste society has always dealt with historical moments of historical change or disjunction, is by ignoring it and by trying to recoup it within a narrative that will take off its radical edge. So such a recouping is being tried by the Hindu right even to this day, where they try to sort of domesticate Ambedkar, try to take him away from his critique of Hinduism, try to make him spokesperson for a very sort of regressive sort of politics that they stand for. So in a sense, Ambedkar stands vindicated that you cannot remain within the fold of this religion and attempt to do anything with it, that you need to completely sort of walk out from it and do something else. Now, over the last 25 years, there's been a greater interest in Ambedkar's conversion. There's been a greater interest in engaging with him from different social groups and different social actors. So Dalits continue to be the mainstay of that engagement. The Indian state continues to be indifferent. This is how I understand it, except it supported republishing some of his writings in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But
thank
how
you.
does the American state treat the King of Du Bois? It's not very different, is it? So,
No, no, thank you.
I had a question also. It might be slightly unclear and inarticulate because I'm still thinking through it, but it has to do with the importance and role of the Sangha that Ambedkar talks about. And you mentioned how he thinks of that somewhat as a vanguardist party in a sense, but one that is ready for dialogue at all times and also convinced of the need for persuasion. But he also calls it a missionary organization and a torchbearer in that sense. So it's one thing to say that you're willing to critically engage with whatever argument, criticism, all those kinds of things. But in practice, it's quite another thing because the role of the very pedagogue in that sense, the missionary, the pedagogue, constitutes a position of privilege in some sense, in a very deep sense actually, and it assumes that in practice in various ways. And so when you understand social position and privilege as relational, as Ambedkar did, and for that I want to quote something he said in about what Gandhi did for the untouchables. I think he says that it's more than bad ideology, it is bad organization which has been responsible for the failure of democracy. And he talks about how invariably rulers are drawn from the ruling class and how that happens. And then he also goes back to this relationality in a different sense when he talks about kamma niyama, and he says that the actions of one affects another instead of the doer as well. It is not so simple, and he talks about it in terms of when he talks about maitri as well. So if you understand that that privilege perhaps has also come at the cost of something, it is usually then a certain type of like social position that has come because of other oppressions that and other processes of marginalization that work. You are only able to cultivate that mindfulness, that thing, because of already certain privileges, the reservations that Brahmanism gives you at some sense is what he also talks about at another point. So this tends to invariably happen. So why I bring this up is because in our present organizations, this plays out at many levels. It plays out with respect to
Shreya,
women.
you have to be loud. I'm losing your voice.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it plays out in our current organizations also in many ways with respect to caste, gender, how people from certain locations are treated, but also when righteousness assumes a place in organization, then sometimes it tends to perpetuate oppression and the silencing of proclamation of difference. And sometimes the angry proclamation of difference, and that is always silenced. And this happens in terms, not only in terms of caste and gender, but also in terms of disability, mental health, all of these things in our spaces. So how do we understand that perhaps the position of the pedagogue, when it comes at the cost of like certain like oppressions? Did Ambedkar point to something where he talks about the need to rethink the sites and processes of cultivating this kind of mindful critical thinking, so that the pedagogue themselves is different? Because he has said a lot about representative, like who represents and the role of the marginalized in the leadership as well.
See, I think we may
Dr.
want to
Gita,
be.
can you repeat the questions and answers so it will be easy for
Yeah,
the
very, very quickly.
recording?
I mean, yeah, no, I think what Shreya is concerned about is if Ambedkar envisaged the Sangha as a kind of vanguardist group that is open to debate and differences, then how do we understand his the purpose that he endowed the Sangha with, which has to be, it has to go forth and convert and work like a missionary organization? Because anybody who feels that they're invested in a certain way of looking at the world and understand the world, they already are in the position of privilege. As pedagogues, they assume that they have learned something which has to be communicated. And often such positions of privilege come from the fact that there are many others out there who've been denied certain things. So how do we then understand what would be the critical checks on the pedagogue, whether in a Sangha or in another organization? Because we've seen that in many organizations, there are issues to do with caste and gender and disability and mental health. When they come to the fore, they don't find the space they deserve. There's never ever enough time to argue through these things. And the role of the pedagogue can be sometimes very unrestrained and all-knowing. So how do we address that? Shreya, I think I've got it right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And also,
So
yeah.
basically, I think there are some things we may want to reflect on. One is that Ambedkar's prescription for the Sangha as such is very much in the context of how do you sort of build a Sangha. Yeah, there is no Sangha in existence that would answer to his Navayana. And the building of that Sangha has to come through a process of observing certain kinds of rules and ordinances and modes of self-cultivation, for which in this text he still draws on the classic canon. But what would he have done with that in practice is not something we can sort of second guess. Knowing the way his organizations function, which is that they were loose-knit organizations, there were lots of people who were part of them, there was room for discussion and argument, but also that they were resourceless. They were essentially organizations of people who had very little to bring to the table in terms of building it with money and with movement and so on. So much of this would have also functioned on the basis of volunteers, of thinkers who had time and leisure to devote to their activities. But let's not forget that many of them were Dalits, whether it was in the ILP or whether it was in the Scheduled Caste Federation. And if they took upon themselves that charge of speaking for Dalits, of playing these pedagogue intellectuals who would then work with the community, one has to give them the weightage that that self-defined responsibility has already invested them with. Whether they were democratic, whether they attended to diverse concerns, it's something that more research and more thought on how they function would reveal to us. We can't say much from the records, except that these were broad-based people's organizations. They were not built like vanguardist parties. So there is that experience of Ambedkar, which then sort of shows him. Then there is the experience of the Communist Party, which is disciplined and which is all of this other stuff. So when he comes to the section on the Sangha, he's drawing from the canon on the one hand, his own experience of building a movement on the other, and the existing communist practice, which is democratic centralism. So he's trying to sort of work out a way, and his own sense that whatever is moral, ethical order he wishes us to evolve into or become into has to be communicated at large to the people at large, and that pedagogy can do that. And the Sangha becomes a site for doing this. Now, how do we sort of think of how the Sangha would have done this in the face of opposition, with the face of different points of view? Ambedkar would still fall back on democratic protocols, democratic ways of arguing. And as he tells his students, how do you reply to something that's a different point of view? You don't come back and attack, you don't come back and use force, you don't come back and sort of downgrade that argument, but you have solid verifiable evidence. You do this way, you do this that way. So that there he speaks like a pedagogue, there he speaks like John Dewey's student. But he also talks about sila, the importance of character building, of how you leave in wisdom with sila, with a certain practice of ethics. So he has left us with general guidelines, and I think these were things that he was reflecting upon in his own context. So if you were to ask me to address this from an Ambedkarite perspective, these are the things one can draw upon. Now, these are not questions that we can address only within the context of what has been left to us, but also in the context of what each of us has seen in the course of history, in the course of time. So I think one has to bring these things into conversation. I don't want to propose that any one part of Ambedkar's thought alone will help us understand this. Ambedkar tried to systematize many things when he wrote the Buddha and this Dhamma, drawing on different aspects of his thought and placing them within a philosophic and critical ethical vocabulary. But as I said, it's equally a point of departure as it is a point of arrival. And let us familiarize ourselves with the various points of arrival to start with: his understanding of democracy, his need for an organization, his insistence on discipline, but at the same time, his openness to pedagogic reflection. After all, the colleges and institutes he started were not restricted to anyone on the basis of birth or gender. He did want an open atmosphere of that social endosmosis in his own universe, in the own educational context that he created. So I think there's enough for us to draw from and reflect on. Perhaps our angst comes from being burdened with a certain vision of the pedagogue, which has come largely from the liberal left traditions that we have inherited. And also, as a kind of response to these liberal left traditions, the sort of the kind of romantic investment in local knowledge systems that have come from the other end. Now, how do you sort of work away from both these traditions while keeping their histories in mind, being mindful of what is happening on the ground, listening to people? And at one level, it has to do with how do you build organizations at every level which answer to the kind of issues that Ambedkar raises, and not simply at the level of the Sangha itself. So if the Sangha is one organization, how do you build civil support systems that will receive the Sangha? And I think those are questions that we might want to think along, Shreya.
No, thank you. I think it's
Hi, Suraj.
hi Geeta. I think you have enriched our Ambedkarite appetite over the scintillating lectures that you have given us, and we are just grateful for your time and your in-depth understanding of Ambedkar through the various coordinates that you bring Ambedkar to us. I think that's a very universal approach of Ambedkar, and we are just happy that you have done a great service of deconstructing Ambedkar for us, and also my friends and comrades with the AKSC who I continue to be in conversation with. Today's conversation, I think in a way, it's almost an ode to Ambedkar's own life trajectory, as to it kind of culminates with Buddhism, and then Buddhism becomes this canon. Now, we all know how Ambedkar had envisioned the Navayana form of Buddhism, and of course you have touched on that. And so when I was reading Buddha and his Dhamma, and I've read it many times, and there's always this this Ambedkar's very much a non-conforming ideological pursuit kind of comes there. Ambedkar comes very much as, and I'm using the word in a mild tone, and not to use but anarchist, in the sense of not following the regularities of how Buddha's values and Buddha's lessons were given. And I think then what Ambedkar does is Ambedkar is actually prescribing what monks, the exhortation of monks. And every time I go to speak on Buddha, especially at the Ambedkarite gatherings, there is obviously a monk, and always tease out that part where Ambedkar wanted monks to be the warriors, the people, and he kind of critiques. Now, my question is, now you see this aspect of Ambedkar's Buddhism is one thing that has a shifting of ideology, and also it's a life ethic. It's basically a anti-caste at its primary nexus, but also it's trying to connect to something more universal and something more ethical. I think that ethics has to do with what he connects as the history of Dalits to the Buddhism, and this is where your ancestors and your Buddhists, right? In modern era after Ambedkar, there is a certain class that kind of accepts Ambedkar's Buddhism. And I don't mean to say the poor people, working class people don't accept Buddhism. I'm talking with this specifically in the urban context, which sanitizes Ambedkar's Buddha to very much a certain different traditions, be it Mahayana tradition or be it the Japanese tradition of the one where they do, there are various versions of Buddhism, and then of course there is a Tibetan version of Buddhism. So in my life, I see the Ambedkarites who are Buddhist almost confused in their life, in the sense of how to programmatically work on Buddhism, and then there is a huge way of meditation and non-meditation. So there is a kind of divide. In your empirical observation, have you come across such kind of a Ambedkar Buddhist tensions that exist in society, and what do you think is the future of these people who are operating in this, or in this context of trying to look at Ambedkar as a hope, but also their Buddhism is very much tied to a very different form of Buddhism than what Ambedkar has professes. And that doesn't mean that they are not following Ambedkar's Buddhism, but of course there is sanitizing happening, and piggybacking kind of in their own practices.
Actually, I can only speak from what I've observed in the Tamil context, where this is also a concern for many Navyana Buddhists in the Tamil context also. In the course of some of the Let's Read Ambedkar lectures that I have sort of been part of in Tamil Nadu, this question has invariably come up, that why is it that there is this interest in evolving a certain, let's put it, affective aesthetic culture of Buddhism rather than the more robust critical culture of Buddhism? Why do you want to observe these functions and festivals and have all of these artis and flowers and all of that, and why not get into a far more philosophical pedagogic mode when we sort of talk of Ambedkar's Buddhism, is one way some of them have posed this question. Then in the Tamil Nadu context, you also have the sort of tradition of Ayotita. So there's also been the Ayotitas tradition of engaging with Buddhism in terms of Buddhism having been part of our rural life worlds for many centuries. Only we have forgotten that. Let's go back to that. So there is also that vis-a-vis, well, not vis-a-vis so much, but Ambedkar's Navyana is far less embedded in our own cultural Tamil context, whereas this is more embedded in our cultural Tamil context. So there are those debates also that are going on in the Tamil Nadu context. Then there are, of course, contemporary conversions which come out of reading Ambedkar, and which are largely sort of smaller groups, but which are also actively present and which are sort of seeing this as a rejection of Hinduism. So I think the interesting tension for me is also between the public rejection of Hinduism and the sort of reworking of Buddhism into one's own life and one's own social context. And these are not necessarily the same. I think the will to reject Hinduism is sometimes greater than to actually embrace Buddhism also. That's right. Also a part of what's going on. And these are things that I've noticed around us. But I think in a more historical sense, what I would like us to think of perhaps is, if there is a certain urban aspirational interest in certain other ways in which one can be a Buddhist, let's say Vipassana, or let's say meditation, or a certain aesthetics, because Buddhism is also a religion of great aesthetics. I mean, it's after all left behind a wonderful body of architecture and art and poetry to us, and we can't ignore those traditions either. And there's a way in which you do bring them together in a meaningful, socially responsible way. And there are groups that do it. There's a Nila Dhamma group in Chennai that does that, for example, where children and women are at the center of these community gatherings in the Ambedkar Memorial Center, and where there's a lot of practice of Maitri and openness and thinking through things and so on. So there are people who are working with those aspects very differently too. But I think in a more historical sense, what's important is the challenge that Ambedkar left us, right? The Buddha and his Dhamma, the conversion itself. What has the rest of Indian society have to say to it? And I think there's a huge, crucial, monumental failure on our part, that we have not engaged with Navayana Buddhism. I mean, the best writings on the subject, sad to say, still come from the tradition of engaged Buddhist scholars in the West. Christopher Queen's work has been the most sustained in terms of how to make sense of this, and various other writers. Not that there are no great writers. There's Pradeep Gokhale, whose work is fantastic. There's a lot of work from within India that's been done, but I think addressing this in a critical sense from the point of view of our failures, that we have not engaged with the critical ethical challenge Ambedkar has thrown us. I mean, he is basically telling us that you as a society, you are so constitutively cruel. What are you going to do about it? And
I mean, sorry, Gita. I'm sorry.
let me just finish, Suraj. Then,
Yeah.
so for me, any sort of rethinking of or any critical engagement with Navayana Buddhism, whether by those who have converted or whether those who refuse to convert and will not even heed it, they exist in a dialectical relationship for me. See, Ambedkar's most creative and brilliant ideas and thoughts emerged out of a very complex debate with his contemporaries, all of whom they may have hated his guts, but they took him seriously from Gandhi onwards, because he was a formidable intellect, a formidable figure in public life. But today, we do not take Ambedkarism seriously as a society, and we are not offering anything by way of a counter argument except of the cheapest kind. And a critical engagement would naturally then sort of push all of us to think through these things far more happily. Otherwise, you want to also preserve what you have, you want to save what you have. That might lead into sanitization, that might lead into a certain kind of inward looking, which is, I agree, not critical, perhaps does not answer the spirit of Navayana. But as a historian, I would see that every philosophy only grows by growing up, by answering to questions, by answering to issues raised by the larger world. Imagine the future of Marxism without Gramsci. Imagine the future of Marxism without Mao. But you need to come to Marxism from those perspectives which share something with it, but which are also saying something more. So I think from within the Dalit circles, questions that are being posed at those that have tried to sanitize Ambedkar's Navayana, there are vigorous debates in all our contexts, I think. But those debates also need to be sort of worked at from different ends. And if we don't do that, we will lose the civilizational centrality that Ambedkar wished to give Buddhism. Because it is a civilizational centrality at the end of the day. And we only have the negative practice of Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand to fall back on, right? And those are not civilizational examples anymore. So I think that is how I would personally see it.
So sorry. I mean, I just I failed to convey that. What I was, maybe I did not mention at all. What I wanted to say is, within your empirical observation, have you seen Buddhism, Ambedkar Buddhism, embraced or discussed by non-Dalits? Where
No.
exactly. Okay.
I mean, there are many of us who are interested in Buddhism, but I, for instance, am very interested in Buddhism. Whether I would embrace Buddhism, I don't know. Not because of anything else, but because I must have that compulsion, that need, that this is, without this, my life doesn't make sense. But if there's somebody who feels atheism helps them make sense of life, or somebody who feels feminism I don't know. For various reasons, we don't embrace it. But the fact is, we must admit that Dalits still have the greatest stake in embracing it, and that they have the greatest ethical charge in embracing it. And we must respect that and value it and talk about it. And we are not doing that enough. And I think that's what really is a moment of great anguish for many of us, that why don't we concede that here is a historical development that is asking us to do something by taking it seriously, that is posing challenges. And instead of addressing those challenges, we want to, in a classic Brahminical way, ignore it. So for me, that is a failure of once again, a caste Hindu society, among many other failures.
Jai Bhim Geeta, and thanks a lot. My question is, I'm rephrasing it after Suraj and Shreya's question. One of the biggest concerns within India, at least, with the anti-caste struggle and the left tradition has been the question of organization. How has Baba Saheb envisaged an organization which could work on annihilating caste? So he does form many organizations, but at the end, when he gave us Buddha and his Dhamma, and he also spoke about the Republican Party, but he was not alive for us to really model it in a particular way. So we are really at large on that question. So does Buddha and his Dhamma also is trying to answer these organizational concerns, the problems that we face in left organizing also, because in the same historical trajectory, the left organizations have been split on many, many questions, mostly theoretical and sometimes practical. And Dalit organizing for an anti-caste ideal also has been caught in many of these questions, like Suraj points out, and like how do we just stick to Buddhism and conversion, and how do we go forward with the project of annihilating caste? And from the left trajectory, the question of the pedagogue or the thinking party or the leadership becoming the overarching figure which will decide the theoretical and practical path. So do you see an organizational direction in Buddha and his Dhamma, and does it only stick to the philosophical and theoretical regime, and what would have been the practice that Baba Saheb might have suggested? I know it's a very open-ended question, but
no, the thing is, there are, I mean, the whole section on the Sangha is about organizations, right? I mean, what is the role? Because you can't have a precept, such as a set of precepts as propounded by the Buddha and as Ambedkar understands these precepts, without doing something about those precepts. Because the way Ambedkar positions Buddha is, he is going to go and share the news of his enlightenment with the rest of the world. So what is a mode through which this is going to happen? And Ambedkar makes it very clear that the Sangha on the one hand, and the precepts as internalized by the laity, by householders and by civil society, as we would call them, on the other hand, are the ways through which the Dhamma can be diffused amongst the large public. Now, organizationally, the Sangha certainly is the one institution that he calls attention to. But as I pointed out in my reply to Shreya, he stays within the limits of what the canon has to say about the Sangha, except that he charges it with a certain missionary-like mandate. He says you can't sit back in your monastery. You can't be so indifferent to social suffering. You have to step out. It's not enough if you meditate. You have to sort of imagine yourself as basically a servant of the poor and come out and talk to them about the importance of the Dhamma. Now, that is the bare skeletal role that he envisages for the Sangha in this text. Otherwise, whatever he talks about the Vinaya, how should the monk shape his life, how should the Teri shape her life, those still follow the rules that are laid out in the Vinaya text. So he's not sort of reworking them for a modern context, except in this broad sense that you get out of the monastery, you go out and you do ministry work amongst the poor, which is a both Christian endeavor and a Buddhist endeavor as far as Ambedkar is concerned. What would be the form of this? How would you go and talk about the Dhamma to a suffering, say, laborer? How would you talk about the Dhamma to a woman who's been hurt? He doesn't sort of go into the details of how does this actually transpire. So we don't have anything from the text itself by way of organizational details as to how this should be done. But then, as I said, one has to think of Ambedkar's own lifelong experience with organizations, what he managed to achieve, what he didn't manage to achieve, and the practice of communist parties. I think for us, the importance of the means of communicating an idea, the worth of an idea, really much of that has been formed in our heads by the histories of the communist movement. Those of us who take ideas seriously, take the ethics of communism seriously as much as the politics of communism. Now, the Communist Party example sadly has proved to be one that is far more geared towards authoritarian ways of functioning than towards more open-ended democratic ways of functioning. Some cases that has been historically defined because many places it was a underground organization, many places it was banned, it had to survive, and so some of these habits got settled into it. But even when those did not exist, it got into a way of being which it sanctified in the name of scientific socialism. So we all have a problem with that, and I sort of wonder then how do we think of any organization which is committed like the communists have been to the practice of a certain way of looking at politics, society, and economics. Then perhaps we might have to keep the sense of the Sangha in mind that Ambedkar leaves us with, and look at the histories and practices of organizations that have done this differently. So for me personally, I mean, this is, you can take it or leave it. I would look at something like, say, the work of the Zapatistas in Mexico, because they have been the most reflexive in terms of how to rethink their strategies, how to accommodate differences, how to deal with people who've left the organization and not sort of therefore completely demonize them. So maybe we should look to different histories of organizing to understand some of this. I would also go and look back at Gramsci's reflections on the practice of the Italian Communist Party. And what does that tell us about how his own misgivings with both the need for and his questions about democratic centralism. I would look at something like that also in terms of trying to build a different sense of an organization. So I don't have any direct answers, but I think if you take Ambedkar's notion of the Sangha seriously as a pedagogic organization that feels convinced about the Dhamma, which feels itself restrained in some ways so that it cannot get arrogant, which feels itself open to listening to people, to heeding what they have to say. After all, Buddha himself was a great dialogue person. Let's not forget. Every insight of the Buddha emerges out of a dialogue with somebody. So there's plenty within that tradition that one can draw from to envisage the Sangha as a pedagogic organization. But having said that, in the modern period, keeping that history in mind, can we look at the histories of organizations which have not been classically communist? I think those might also be a way of thinking about some of the issues that Ambedkar raises for us through the Dhamma and through the Sangha.
I want to start by first thanking you for this really wonderful and powerful lecture series. My name's Nupur. I'm a clinical psychologist who's been working with folks from marginalized backgrounds, particularly in the US, but also in India, and around the intersectionality of caste, social class, gender, LGBTQ identities, etc. So my question to you is, a lot of my work centers around recovery from trauma and resilience and coping, but when I'm thinking about Dalit women being thrice oppressed, and that how systemic and how institutionalized all these factors are against them, I am curious about your thoughts, given your work experience with women and feminist movements in India. What are the implications for recovery from trauma, especially as Dalit folks or women have been doing a lot of the hard work for decades? But what needs to happen in terms of institutional change? What needs to happen in terms of even implications for allyship? What is needed at a systemic it's a pretty broad macro question, but what's needed at a systemic level in order to be able to have collective healing happen from all the isms coming together, working against the marginalized folks?
It's a large question. I don't know if I have any ready-made answer, obviously not. But I think one of the things that reading Ambedkar's work over the past decade and more has taught me is that the process of changing systems cannot be taught outside of the process of reflecting critically on one's own life and one's own relationship with others. So I think one of the things that therefore one needs to do in one's encounter with suffering of any kind, whether it's material suffering or trauma or just everyday angst that countless women go through on account of the unnatural nature of conjugality itself. There are issues that come at each of us by way of suffering, and how does that one then deal with it? I think I personally feel that the whole idea of Maitri, for example, as fellowship, as the fact that we are, for better or for worse, implicated in each other's lives, that we cannot run away from that implication. And that causes hurt in some cases, but there can also be a way in which you extend comradeship, you extend affection in different ways, without really constantly asking to be proved right in terms of, I am really suffering, therefore, that's a question that many of us ask. Someone comes to us, are you really suffering, is a question that we ask. And I think it's a very problematic way of approaching anything. Even within feminist spaces, we've all had to struggle with how do you listen to a complaint which irritates you after a while. Like someone comes and she's obviously being battered, but she says, I want to get back to my married life. It irritates you, right? You don't want to deal with it. And you think that's not a genuine complaint. She cannot ever have a feminist consciousness. But the thing is, I think how do you stay with that suffering which is real for that individual? And she is obviously there because she wants out of it, but at the same time not rush at it with a certain philosophical, political model you have in your head. And therefore Maitri becomes important, that I must trust my relationship of affectionate interest, critical interest in her life before I volunteer any solution on my own. Of course, I will volunteer. I cannot help volunteering. I have thoughts, I have ideas. It would be very hypocritical if I didn't say something. But how do you sort of then work with that sort of a trauma, which also is pretty sort of tied to a one solution thing? And I'm sure as a psychologist, you know this, psychiatrist, you know how people also have solutions. They don't actually come to you only for solutions. They want you to listen to their solutions also. So I think that whole idea of Maitri, which makes you listen, which makes you heed, and which somewhere at some point opens into a dialogue through which you arrive at some kind of a resolution of the problem, if not a solution, some resolution of the problem at a one-to-one level that's there. I think with the suffering of Dalit women, of women who face immense psychosocial and historical of ways of being completely sort of left out of the social itself, of not being considered human enough, of not being considered somebody who's capable of reflection or thought or of anything really. I think that the most horrible thing that can happen to in a situation like that is to only see them as victims, and is to see that they are recipients of a social system that's left them so negative that we've got to rush from outside and do something. But I think here again, one of the biggest lessons that the feminist movement has to fully yet learn is to also understand that those who endure such violence, who survive such violence, such a deliberate diminishing of their persona, of their personhood, also are people who have a lot to tell you about the kind of society you are, right? And I think listening to that indictment then becomes very important. That indictment immediately might um, incite a response that is defensive, but I am not like that. We are not like that. We are feminists, we are socialists, we are X, Y, Z or whatever. But the fact is that you are not a Dalit already makes you part of that society in which for centuries you benefited from that labor and that stigma. So I think that whole thing of heeding, listening, holding back, and trying to reach that point of dialogue, and with Dalit and Bahujan women also, to perhaps be willing to learn that there's a way in which they have looked at it, they have answers, and they're telling you because you haven't really been part of that experience, you can't be part of that experience. And I think what comes to us from that, and what we might bring to it because we are privileged, we have resources, we have access to the state or whatever else, but then that dialogue becomes a very rich and important dialogue, I think. And I think there's been some really interesting experiences in the United States itself from what African American thinkers and women have brought to feminism, and what many of us have learned from also. And I think similarly trying to learn from what the indictive political philosophy that Dalit and Bahujan women are bringing to the table, and also incredibly generous ways of living that they then sort of want us to understand and also see as part of the solutions that we propose. Like even with this whole COVID thing, what always strikes me is when people are saying there are people in Dharavi and they're dying and it's horrible, people are going to sort of, terrible things are going to happen. But we also forget Dharavi is also a place that has taught people how to live. Dharavi is a place that has taught people how to sort of survive, give each other room, even when there's no physical room, right? I mean, and there's an incredible politics of living together that we need to also foreground, and not just say that we will come outside and we will teach you social distancing, we will do this, we will do that. So I think a lot of this is something we need to keep in mind. How do we privilege the traditions of Dalit Bahujans as teaching something to the rest of us?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my question is regarding a section in Buddha and his Dhamma where Ambedkar discusses innovation in the practice of Dhamma Diksha. That in the ancient Buddhism, Dhamma Diksha was reserved only for the bhikkhus and which was not open for laities, and that in a way led to, he speculates that led to the decline of Buddhism, and he would want to open it up. So in our context, it also means rethinking in a way, not just the practice of Buddhism, but the relation between religion and politics itself. Because in the middle of the 20th century, when religion was on the side of counter-revolution and politics was taught only from within a certain rational atheist way, the revolutionary politics. So in that context, I think can we return to the question of organization, where because so far the models of organization we've been talking about have never really taken the reinvention of religion as its own task. So would you want to comment on that?
Thanks so much, Vaibhav, for bringing me back to that passage, which is a very important passage, because I think what Ambedkar is also telling us is the reason that Buddhism did not sustain itself was it lacked an organization that would convey to the laity the importance of the Dhamma. The bhikkhus have their Sangha, of course, but what would then convey to the laity the importance of the Dhamma, which means that we have to seriously engage with the path of reorganizing what you call a space of religion itself, and what would be the organizational forms to do that. I think with Buddhism, it becomes particularly interesting because um, provided that you don't see Buddhism only in terms of everyday practices and everyday actions, which are of course an important part of following any path, secular or religious, but also in terms of an organization that would convey the centrality of the Dhamma at every level, as Ambedkar and Dewey would tell us, from the family to the state. And what would be the organizational structure that does that? And historically, those have been sort of institutions, as you rightly put it, which are related to religion, which either have to do with community structures uh, that oversee cultural practices, or satsangs, or sectarian groups that draw people into their fold because they propound a religious worldview, which is a dissident worldview. So these are the forms of organizations that have evolved historically over time, which convey the sense of a different way of living. And I think it is an important part of our work as those invested in Baba Saheb's life world and thought world, to look at those histories as well. And I think thank you for pointing that out. And those histories are so far have been studied largely by the anthropologists of religion, who've looked at various modern practices and seen how the forms of religious institutionalism that have evolved in the modern period, how do they connect with the past and how do they continue in the present. But I think you are raising a different set of questions. What have been the forms of organizing that have conveyed the truths that are reserved for a sphere of religion? And if we are engaged with the Dhamma, how do we think of those organizational forms? How do we go beyond them? And this is not simply about the Sangha itself as an organization, but of a different mode of organizing. And I think I personally would start with looking at what are these other forms of organization, and do extant Buddhist forms mimic those organizations? Are they like them? Are they different? Are they doing something else? And I think it's an interesting question, and there is enough in the history and practice of religions to point to the directions in which one can go with this. Thank you for that question.
My question is, most of these conversions are done like Christian conversion, Muslim conversion, Buddhist conversion, whatever the conversion is done by somebody really oppressed or having real problem on discrimination and things like that. So, I mean, that's what I am saying mostly, and I don't know whether you agree with that or not. But my question is, in that case, are we really liberating them, or we are again categorizing them into something and then putting them down again? What are we really trying to do by converting them if only oppressed people are getting converted?
Maybe we can re-ask the question this way, Lakshmi. I don't think there is conversion, whether it's those who turn to Buddhism today or in the past or to any other religion. I think in a lot of ways, there were people who spoke to them about these religions, whether Islam or Christianity or Buddhism. But the decision to convert was always made by the convert for the most part. There may have been instances where they joined others without thinking, but I think historically it's possible to prove that the converts made that choice. So they obviously felt their life situations were unbearable and they wanted to go into another way of being and doing. Now, whether that changes society, whether society treats them differently, that's a different set of questions. Clearly, for a person who converts, for a Dalit who converts to another religion, society will still see her or him as a Dalit, as we have found out in the course of all these conversions that have happened. But for the convert, it makes a huge difference as to the kind of person he or she sees herself to be, and puts her or him in a situation where she can come back to this other very cruel and unjust social world with a greater degree of self-confidence and challenge that world better and differently. Now, if we don't take those conversions seriously as a society, the fault is really ours and not that of the converts. Whether it's a solution or not, I'm loath to say whether it's right or wrong, because I do believe that anybody who makes that choice, it's like the choice to join a political party, no? I mean, I like the DMK, I join it. The DMK turns out to be a party that's not really doing much for me, but I stay with it. So I think the choice is something we consciously make when we convert or when we choose a political ideology. Now, what that does for the society from which the convert is from, that depends on the rest of us also. So I would actually look at it that way. And I don't think any of us would want to go at conversion without taking the convert into our own confidence. And in many cases, the convert has been a very decisive figure. I think that's what the histories of conversion teach us.
That's why my question was to us, not the one
Yes,
converting.
yes.
What are we doing to them?
Yeah, what are we doing is a question we need to answer forcefully, that in an everyday political sense we need to insist on how we support constitutional rights, how we are part of struggles that the marginalized carry out in their everyday lives, what difference can we make in a personal sense. In all these levels we need to think simultaneously, I think. And one of the things is that the power and weight of philosophies such as those of Ambedkar or Periyar or Marx have been such that even those that don't directly suffer under any kind of oppression have been drawn to them and have tried to keep themselves in these positions of solidarity and support. So I would sort of see it that way. And if many of us don't, then we'll have to see how we get those others also to start thinking.
Thank you.
The question is, how do you see the Supreme Court verdicts on reservation in promotions for SC and ST not being a fundamental right, with the caste discrimination very much present in institutions?
Krishnapriya, you've answered the question yourself. It has been argued very forcefully how it's a fundamental right. Dr. Balagopal, when he wrote on the Madiga reservation sought within the larger quantum of reservations for Dalits in Andhra Pradesh at that time, argued brilliantly why that sort of a compartmentalized reservation was a fundamental right, and how reservations within promotions cannot be taken away from the fundamental right that has been guaranteed by the First Amendment and so on. But I think the present government is also trying to dismantle the very modest legal victories that we've won in the past, is trying to dismantle the protective aspects of our constitution. So, and of course, we remain a caste society at so many levels that not enough of us are fighting these kinds of disfiguring of our constitution. So all these things have come together in the present moment.
There are two questions. I'll read the first question. While Ambedkar remains a powerful figure for the Dalit community today, to what extent do his ideas have a substantive role in contemporary anti-caste movements? This is the first question. So second question is, what has been the impact on the Dalit community of the recently passed laws against conversion?
The laws against conversion have not been upheld in many of the states themselves. Tamil Nadu itself pulled back and did away with its anti-conversion law after passing it. So that question is a simple one to answer. Now, what has been the impact of Ambedkar's thought world on anti-caste movements? I think one of the things is that ever since Ambedkar's passing away after the 1950s, the whole anti-caste tradition, whether it's Periyar or Ambedkar, there has been a periodic renewal of these legacies, either by those that have already sort of part of these movements, or by those who feel that there are aspects of these movements that are need to be radicalized and we want to foreground those. So I think these legacies are being kept alive by those that are committed to anti-caste politics. As far as Ambedkar's own life work and thought world are concerned, Dalits have very consciously and over a long period of time kept that memory alive, kept that practice alive, constantly passed it on within their own communities, within their own immediate context, whether it's a village or a region or a state in the Indian context or outside. And I think they have been the sort of torchbearers, let me say, of Ambedkarism in a very fundamental way. And they have forced many of us, because of the great credibility they've brought to their work by way of their politics sometimes and by way of their ethical reasoning and by the way of their learning, to take Ambedkar's writing seriously. So to that extent, I think they have broadened the spectrum of anti-caste politics from those that were traditionally part of it to include many others who were not traditionally part of it. Some time ago, I spoke of how Revanthi and I used to organize these social justice events in Chennai for an entire month, starting from 2014. And we have been very interested in the number of young people who keep coming for these events, not all of whom are part of any particular political organization or any anti-caste movement, and not all of whom are Dalits. So I think there is a way in which this legacy has been growing and widening, and today there's a very rich presence of Dalit Bahujan thinkers and intellectuals at every level. So I would say that Ambedkar's legacy is, whether people fully read him or not, is kept alive through other means also, and that's a very important part of what we have learned over the last few decades.
I think thank you. Thank you very much. So if anybody have questions, please write to us. Comrade, do you have any closing comments before we close?
No, first of all, I mean, I really think that I feel very poignant about this big effort that AKSC has undertaken, and I think it's a very important thing that we did this in April when we think of Baba Saheb's life and work intensively across India, and it is very sort of unsettling times that we are in. It has been very important to go back to a man whose life was such an inspiring example for countless people, and also that resource of hope and that resource of wanting to sort of make the world a better place than what he found it. In that inheritance, it's good to remember that in a creative, dialogic way. And so, thanks a lot for allowing us the space and time to do it. And I do wish that we can have more extended conversations on the subject from the American side also, which is from the side of the African American struggle against racism, because that would be a very, very rich thing. And if at some point in the future you have inputs from that end, it would be fascinating for some of us to listen in and learn, because we've all looked up to that tradition as well in a very important way. And Ambedkar himself followed African American history with great interest, and he was in touch with Du Bois. He had read Henry Apthekar's work on the Civil War. And so I think it would be a very important learning experience for all of us. And I think it's a great experience to be part of a large global community who's invested in these concerns. And that also, as you said in the beginning, Karti, that these new means of communication have made that possible in a very sort of creative kind of way. So thanks everybody, and thanks for making this possible, and a big jai bhim to all of you. So.
Yeah. So thank you. Surely, Comrade, we are working with the African American activists and professors.
Fantastic.
And we will try to have him here for a couple of sessions on King and overall race question. That's all. Thank you, JB.
Jai Bhim.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.